Hi, good evening, everyone. We're going to get started here momentarily. I want to let everybody have an opportunity to be admitted into the meeting and ask everyone to ensure that you remain on mute while we're doing our presentation. Again, thank you for joining us. We'll get started here in a brief moment. I think we're going to get started, everyone. Thank you for taking the time this evening to join us for the Sacramento River Parkway Project Property Owners Meeting. This is the second of 3 meetings that we're doing with property owners along the project alignment to provide an update. I want to thank you again for taking the time and remind you and ask you again to please remain on mute while we are going through our presentation. I do also want to let everyone know that this is being recorded and will be posted on the project website so that those that did not get a chance to attend this meeting have the ability to understand the presentation and listen to any of the questions and answers that are given this evening. So thank you again. And with that, I'm going to pass this to do some introductions, and I'm going to pass this to Megan Johnson, the project manager for this project for the city of Sacramento.
Hi, everyone. I'm Megan Johnson, Senior Engineer with the City of Sacramento's Public Works Department, and I am the city's project manager for this project. And I just want to take a moment and echo Noah's thoughts that I want to thank you guys for joining us for this discussion tonight. Now I'll hand it over to Matt.
Good evening. My name is Matt Salveson. I work with an engineering firm here in Sacramento named Wood Rogers, and I am the manager of the consultant team that's supporting Megan and her crew over at the city.
And good evening, everyone. My name is Noah Painter. I am a sub to Wood Rogers. Our firm is KMP Strategies, and we focus on public outreach for projects such as the Sacramento River Parkway. We focus on infrastructure, roadway, and large public works projects. One of the items that we do want to do before we really dig into the presentation is just kind of go over our meeting rules. I want to take a few minutes to go over those ground rules this evening. We understand that everyone has a strong opinion on both sides of this project. We just ask that you be respectful of everyone's opinion and hold your questions until the project team has completed our presentation. We have about an hour scheduled for the presentation and Q&A. But we're going to take as much time as needed to answer the questions this evening. We have great attendance, and so we're probably going to run a bit longer than 1 hour. And we're happy as the project team to stay on as long as we can to answer questions that you as residents have regarding this project and the presentation.
All right, so this is where I jump in. So as a state, California is blessed with natural resources. And our rivers, beaches, and lakes have been enjoyed by residents and visitors alike since the first people arrived here. As California's population increased and urbanization and private development began to cut off these resources, a series of legislative acts were taken in the 1970s to ensure continued public access to our waterways. This included a voter initiative in 1972, which led to the creation of the California Coastal Commission and the Coastal Act, which preserved public access to the coast. And then there was State Assembly Bill 1504, which required that new subdivision developments adjacent to public waterways were to include a dedication for public access adjacent to the river or stream. This was then incorporated into the Subdivision Map Act and added to state code. And then with regards to trails, they improve mental and physical health, they connect communities, and they provide recreational and mobility benefits. Now here's a bit of high-level background on the origins of the pocket and its development. As most of you are probably aware, the pocket area was first settled by Portuguese immigrants back in the 1850s as a rural farming community. The population in the pocket started to increase when the pocket was annexed into the city in 1959. The early residential developments which followed in the 1960s were largely on the north side of the pocket. In the mid-70s, with the construction of I-5 and a new connection of Pocket Road to Riverside Boulevard, there was more growth and an increase in development in the pocket to the south. And as mentioned, the Subdivision Map Act went into effect around that same time, which required developers to dedicate public access easements next to the river for approval of the tentative maps for those new subdivisions. So that was an overview of the development of the pocket. And this is an overview of the development of the Sacramento River Parkway Trail Project. In the 1970s, as new subdivision developments were including dedications adjacent to the river for public access, the Sacramento River Parkway Master Plan established an official vision for a recreational trail that would connect Freeport in the south all the way up to the confluence with the American River near downtown. As the pocket continued growing to the south following the construction of I-5, the Sacramento River Trail was then included in the Pocket Area Community Plan in 1979. Then not a lot happened for a while until 1997, when an update of the plan accounted for the changing land uses that had occurred since 1975, and it confirmed the vision for the Levee Top Trail. In 2012, Council then adopted an implementation plan for the American and Sacramento River Parkway plans, which identified actions that would lead to a 25-mile connected river trail system. In 2015, we started taking concrete steps towards implementing that vision. Our first steps were small, attempting to tackle it in short segments using local funds. First, we started working on a locally funded project between Garcia Bend Park and Pocket Canal. Then in 2017, Council gave direction to develop a locally funded project between Pocket Canal and Arabella Way. These efforts made progress. However, as federal and state grant programs began to prioritize significant amounts of funding for bike and pedestrian trails, we identified an opportunity to leverage our local funds to bring in more federal and state funds, which then lets our local funds stretch a lot farther. In 2021, we were awarded the federal funds for the environmental clearance and preliminary engineering for the full stretch in the pocket. And so we kicked off this effort earlier this year. We did lose some momentum with this change in strategy, but this will allow us to have a cohesive engagement and design effort rather than piecemealing the various segments. So I'm not going to read through all of these, but this trail will advance a number of city policies which specifically seek to develop the Sacramento River Parkway as a recreational corridor to benefit the Sacramento public. So with that, I'll hand it over to Matt, who will share some information with you about the project delivery.
All right, in the broadest terms, the project between Garcia Bend on the south and Zacharias Park on the north is divided into two segments, separated approximately at Arabella Way. The purpose for this division really has more to do with providing additional opportunities for how the city is going to go about securing the remaining funding on the project. Conceivably, one segment could be built before the other, or if the city is able to obtain all the funding, it could all be built at the same time. Next slide, please. In terms of the benefits and the goals of the project, I mentioned the two segments there. In general, over on the right-hand side, we've got four large or important bullets over there. The trail will provide expanded access to natural resources and open space. Of course, provide a biking and walking trail free of without conflict from motor vehicles. And it also provides some important connections to adjacent trails and nearby bike routes. And fundamentally, throughout all of it needs to be compliant with the Americans with Disability Act. Next slide, please. In terms of the engineering and project delivery process that Wood Rogers is partnering with the city on, we're in the first phase over at the left, the preliminary engineering and environmental clearance and documentation phase. And that runs roughly through the end of 2023. We're in the process of developing preliminary engineering concepts. As those get developed, those will be shared with the public for comment and input. And that preliminary engineering in turn informs the environmental review process. That's been started. The city is clearing the project, the entire segment 1 and segment 2 under both CEQA, which is the California environmental requirements, and under NEPA, the federal requirements. And the federal requirements are kicking in there because of the color of money, and that is there's federal dollars involved. So far, we've largely been involved, in addition to a bit of preliminary engineering, but with data collection. And I'll get a little more detail on the next slide, what's been involved there. Once that first phase of work is wrapped up, the team will move into the final design phase. That's where we prepare the actual documents that the city will put out to bid for construction. And in parallel with that, and before construction start, of course, there's the right-of-way phase where the city will need to obtain a number of easements along the trail. I'd like to emphasize down the box at the bottom, the community outreach. I think the public can expect public coordination and outreach to continue throughout the entire project delivery phase. And while we're not showing a construction phase on this slide, throughout that phase as well. It's the city's intent to keep the lines of communication open and make sure everybody's hearing the public's concerns and suggestions. Next slide. I mentioned data collection. That's been a big part of what we've done so far. That's largely consisted of topographic mapping, surveying, so that we can have a good initial estimate of what's out there on the levee. I'm certainly very much aware, as all you folks are, about the work that's going on out there, so that the shape of the levee will be changing throughout our project delivery process. And then associated with the environmental work under CEQA and NEPA, there's a number of specific technical studies that the team has started working on. Most notably would be the biological studies, which involves evaluating what the existing biological resources are. And there's a number of cultural studies, which relates to what the cultural resources are within the project there. In both cases so far, we've been able to entirely avoid getting on any private property. The aerial mapping for the survey has been based on flight crosses that were placed in public right of way, and we haven't had to get inside of private property. And the same has been true for the environmental technical studies. And we're endeavoring to avoid that to the greatest extent possible. And just note the box at the lower right there. The city staff will always request permission to enter if and when we need to get onto private property for any of this work. And again, even then, we're hoping to largely avoid that throughout the project delivery process. I've got one more bullet. We've also been doing some research on, down at the bottom there, the last bullet on the existing right-of-way status, and we largely leverage what's called preliminary title reports. and record survey data and right-of-way data from the city to define what the existing right-of-way conditions are out there. Next slide. In terms of the design, in particular, the preliminary engineering and design efforts that are going on and will continue to go on. The design of the trail itself is pretty straightforward. It will be an asphalt concrete path on top of the levee. That's relatively straightforward. What's a little more interesting and challenging is to figure out how that trail will be accessed. There's some logical and compelling sources, such as likely upgrading the access point on the southern end at Garcia Bend. But we're currently evaluating approximately 10 locations for their feasibility. And I've got more details on that on the next slide in terms of exactly what we're looking at, with the ultimate goal of narrowing that down to about 5 recommended locations. We won't be doing that in a vacuum. The public in the near term, probably the next round of public meetings, will see some of our initial recommendations, thoughts, concerns, questions, and we'll have an opportunity to not only provide their input on what we're suggesting and what we've got so far, but also provide suggestions and advice. You folks are the experts. Actually, you're the most familiar with the area. And so we're looking for input from the public on this. So look for more of that to come. Next slide. In terms of some of the items we're looking at in terms of trying to figure out how the trail should be accessed, we're looking at how the access points relate to any of the biological resources. One of the big ones up there is the existing trees. We don't want to have to cut down or damage any more of the trees than we have to. Obviously, we want to minimize or avoid any impacts to existing private right-of-way. We're looking carefully at the implications to parking, both in terms of how easy will it be for the public to access and how might that parking affect the local residents down there. Of course, we're looking at it from a efficiency and feasibility standpoint with that third bullet. Do the access points make sense relative to existing trails and existing bike routes on the surface streets? And then as a core value, safety. We want to make sure that those access points are safe and don't create any undue hardship to anybody out there. And things that factor into that are things like lighting, visibility, as well as the physical location of the access points. Along those lines, one of the items the team is tasked with is to develop a detailed safety plan through coordination, in particular with SAC PD, as well as you folks and the residents out there. And that is front and center to everything we're going to be doing on this project. All right. In terms of some additional items on the environmental clearance side, we're going to be looking at grading, layout design, basically defining what the project footprint is so that we can identify and mitigate any potential environmental impacts. Make sure we understand what all the environmental constraints are. I mentioned in particular, we're looking carefully at biological resources and cultural resources. And at the end of this process in 2023, the city and Wood Rogers will need to deliver a document consistent with the CEQA requirements for the state. The city's the lead agency for that. And the federal requirements under NEPA. And for various reasons, Caltrans is the lead agency for NEPA. All right. Timeline of the project, approximately, I talked about 2 different phases. The first being the preliminary engineering and environmental documentation. That's approximately 18 months total, wrapping in 2023. And then final design and right-of-way approximately 18 months after that. The plus and minuses, there's there's a number of variables on both those fronts that could either accelerate or shorten that a bit. But in general terms, that's the approximate timeline. And let me just emphasize again, throughout this entire process that we're talking about here, I think you can expect continuous community outreach. You can see the city, you will see the city partnering with SAC PD as well as the community in regard to safety. And then finally, but also important, is the city will be working throughout that period to leverage their local dollars, the city's local dollars, to obtain additional federal and state funding. So the idea is to deliver the most benefit to the local Sacramento community while using the least amount of local dollars. We definitely like to be able to leverage what we have towards expanded federal and state funds. All right, Noah, it's on to you.
Thanks, Matt. One of the most important aspects of this project is the community outreach. We want to hear from you, and more importantly, we want to listen and learn what's most important. This will help inform the design of the project. We have developed a comprehensive outreach plan that includes a project webpage that'll be used to provide project information and updates. Please feel free to check it out. It's www.SacRiverParkway.org. We've created a dedicated project hotline and email, which will be shown on the next slide. And our goal with that is to have one of our project team members to be able to respond within 2 business days. We're also planning small group meetings like this one, and one-on-one meetings with property owners and folks in the community as needed. We've also planned larger community meetings and provide community updates as the project progresses and we have more work product to be able to discuss with the community. We want to be able to also send out project surveys so that we can obtain community feedback on key aspects of the project design. So with that being said, we've really spent a lot of time in the early months of this project trying to develop a comprehensive outreach plan so that everyone has an opportunity to weigh in on this. Like we said at the beginning of the meeting, regardless of their opinion of support or concern about the project, our goal as the project team is to be able to deliver a project that is going to have input from everybody in the community. The outreach team has the project hotline, which is area code 916-808-1705, and a dedicated project email address, which is SacRiverParkway@cityofsacramento.org. The great thing about these is folks that do reach out to us on the email or the phone number, you're reaching out to the project team. It's either Megan, myself, Emma on our project team, and we're able to respond to you quickly. A lot of times what happens is if somebody has a concern or a comment and they go to the council member or the city manager's office, it does take some time to get to us to be able to respond. I'm not going to say that we're going to be able to provide information right away, but what we will be able to do is respond to you and then work on being able to obtain the information if you have a detailed or technical question. With that being said, that's the end of our presentation. And what we want to do now is be able to take time. We have a lot of folks here, and I'm sure a lot of folks have questions. So we want to be able to take the time to answer those questions. So what we would really like to do is ensure that everybody has an adequate option to ask as many questions as they need to. So if you could please use the function to raise your hand in the Zoom. And what we'll do is go one by one based on who raises their hand, and we'll work down that list. We found that works well and allows everybody adequate time to answer their questions or ask their questions and us to give you answers. Okay, looks like we have Mark. Hi, Mark, I'm going to ask you to unmute your phone or your computer.
Yeah, and I'm sorry, we're able to ask like additional follow-up questions, right? I mean, it's an open-ended.
It's open-ended.
Yeah.
It's the point of these smaller group meetings is so that folks have an opportunity to ask more than one question and really for us to be able to kind of dig deep into this.
Okay. So for part of the plan I have questions about, and I'm sure that you're going to hear them from other folks. are primarily kind of around the privacy outside of security, because also a lot of our properties go all the way to the actual high water mark. And so, well, I guess I'll just start with the question about privacies. I mean, so are we able then, with this new trail coming in, or wanting to have it come in, have privacy barriers up on the top of the crown? Because that's the main concern, especially for mine, is when I'm in my bedroom window, we're much closer than the other other properties kind of south by Garcia Park. And so, I can be lying there and I could see someone looking directly down into my room. I don't want to be someone that has to have my blinds drawn all the time. And so that question about privacy is really the utmost importance for me.
So I can jump in a little bit. We are definitely very early in the process on this, and we're very aware that privacy is going to be a big concern for the residents. We're going to be diving into the options as we move forward. And to tell you the truth, I was thinking about the privacy wall at the top earlier today. And my concern there would, we don't want to create spaces where people can kind of hide behind the privacy wall, out of the line of sight from people on the trail. And so, those are the kind of, do you know what I mean? Like if there's a wall at the very top that separates you from the trail, we don't want to have a spot where people can go in the space between the wall and your residence.
My backyard. That's my backyard.
Correct. Yes.
Well, I'll be in my backyard.
So we're going to be looking into those options, Mark. And, as we come back to you and have more time to hear about what the concerns are and any ideas that you guys have that would make you feel better, then we can talk about what we can do, what we can't do, and take that into account.
Well, I think it's kind of this idea of wanting to be able to, folks are, and this is the very first meeting or the second meeting, I guess, but there is this idea of people not really feeling heard. This idea of kind of fostering trust. And so
yeah,
I'm talking about privacy because it is my property. It's just an easement for my property. And yet we're talking about, well, we don't want to have the people on the trail be blocked from me on my own property.
No, sorry, that's not what I was referring to. My concern is that you might get folks who don't want to be visible from the trail who might hide behind the wall and then be adjacent to your property. But again, without knowing what the dimensions are between your property and the trail, it's very hypothetical at this point. And so, your point about privacy fences and screenings is something that we'll look into. We just want to make sure that as we do it, we don't create safety. We don't want to put in things that might make it worse rather than better. So we will be looking at different options.
Okay. I mean, yeah, because that's my question. It's kind of like worse for who?
Worse for you.
Well, right. Yeah.
Correct. Yeah. We're trying to avoid that. Yeah. So, and I think we'll have more answers, as to right now, we haven't gone back to see what the conditions are between the private, like where it's private property yet, because we don't have access to that right now. But I think that as we move forward with the design, it'll be important for us to request permissions to walk on the levee back there so that we can take a closer look at the conditions and start developing ideas.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, just because we're referencing these two plans from the 70s and the 90s, but they were very explicit about saying, actually having patrols up there, closing at dusk and dawn. Yeah. And also ensuring that there's some type of privacy for the homeowners. Yeah. And my worry is that since the 1997 plan to now, that's kind of fallen away, because I know there was also an idea of putting it on the berm where possible, and I think there's a lot of people that would support that as well. But I don't know why that's been kind of nixed to just make it on the very top of the trail.
And I don't want to imply that it's nixed. We're going to be looking at options. We just want to make sure that there's not hiding spots for people as we do these options.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Mark. We have one question that was asked in the chat, and then we're going to go to Gerald Miles. Gerald was the next one that raised their hand. Megan, this probably is the best question for you. It says, I have significant doubts about any safety plan. I've gone down the American River Parkway and there's no safety plan in place. It's trashed and filled with homeless. What's to stop that from happening here? This isn't to hate on any plan or the people who would enforce the plan. It's just not realistic. And I think the past 2 years is proof of that.
Yeah, I understand your concerns, John. And we are early in this process. You know, there are, of course, going to be limitations about, you know, whether engineering projects can solve all society's problems. But it's our intention to work closely with SacPD and the residents to find any options that we can do to make it as safe as we possibly can.
Great. I'm gonna ask Gerald Miles to unmute next.
So following up on that previous comment, Megan, around making it as safe as you possibly can, I think the safest it could possibly be is the way it is today with fences. Everything you do is only going to make it less safe. I think that's fair to say. That is not my question. I'm just following on the previous comment that you just shared. I was at Garcia Bend last year, and the park ranger was there, and I was chatting with him, and he mentioned that there's 2 park rangers for all of the parks within Sacramento City, and that he was just overwhelmed with the amount of land that he had to secure. And so the question I have is what, and then yes, it's around the security plan that's in place for when the levee becomes less secure. What's the enhanced security plan? We know that Nordic Industries required 24-hour private security last year for Sorrel 2, and they had a police officer stationed during the day to avoid the harassment of the homeless population. Given that level of need for security, what do you propose?
So thank you for your question. Yeah, at this point, we're very early into the plan. Our first step before we start developing the plan is to get this feedback from the residents. And so we will be working on developing that plan and working with the rangers and working with SacPD. And then we'll return to you folks to talk through it. But at this point, you know, our role is to take feedback from the property owners on, you know, ideas that you have.
Sure. Following up on Mark's dialogue with you as well, I believe we just saw how quickly Nordic was able to remove 15 feet of dirt, and how easily it would be to create a toe and a berm for the Parkway trail to be not on the high point, but on the water side. Within 2 weeks, the levee as we know it was gone and just dirt. It's not too difficult to see how quickly a trail could be erected and the levee put back from a design perspective. Definitely the feedback that I would have is create a berm and do not put it on the crown of the levee, but on the toe that could be quickly designed and built.
Okay, yeah, thanks for that feedback. Matt, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, but I think that, you know, at this point, we're taking feedback and evaluating things as we move forward.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting idea. You're right, from a construction standpoint, it's probably feasible. to do that. There's a lot of challenges though, from a regulatory standpoint. If we do anything that's not on the levee, that's not saying it shouldn't be explored. But there's a lot of permitting that needs to be done, as you might imagine, and as most of you or all of you know. Anytime you touch a levee or want to make modifications to it, unless you're the Army Corps yourself, there's some interesting logistical challenges to that. But Gerald, I thank you for the suggestion, and I think it's definitely worth discussion.
Thank you.
Thanks, Gerald. We're going to go to Jason next. Jason, I'm going to ask if you can unmute your phone.
Sure. Hey guys. Thanks for putting this on. I really appreciate it. It's great to get this information out there. Obviously you're dealing with all the private property owners, so that's a little bit of a challenge. I'm actually a 5th generation Sacramentan and have great grandparents who lost their house to the WX freeway and Cap City freeway. So kind of familiar with the eminent domain process, even though that was both before my time. But it feels like things are being done a little bit out of order, and that we're assuming we're going to build a bike trail before there's like access to the property to actually do this. And I haven't heard what that looks like. Like, how are you going to go about getting private property taken over to benefit thousands of Sacramentos? I think the freeways seem like a different situation, right? There's 30,000 people that drive on the freeway a day. There's dozens of people that use the bike trail a day. What's the justification for it? And like, what's the process? And have alternatives been looked at? I guess would be my follow-up question. That there's a giant park that runs through like down to 60% of Pocket that already has a bike trail on it that you can improve and still connect things together. Is that a consideration?
So I can jump in and touch on that. And then Matt, if you have anything that I missed, feel free to jump in. In terms of the order, okay, just to make sure it's clear, this is not necessarily a rubber stamped project where we're going to be moving construction vehicles in next year. There's a whole series of pretty well-defined steps that we have to take before this is an approved project. And so for those steps, where we're at right now, we're doing the preliminary engineering, the iterations and evaluating the different access points and things like that. We also need to go through the environmental clearance phase for state and federal clearance. Once we get to that point, we're not allowed to start with the right-of-way process until we have our environmental clearance. And because part of that environmental clearance is looking at what the impacts are, looking into alternatives, things like that. And so once we have a project that's environmentally cleared, then we're allowed to start with the right-of-way process. And so then we'll be going through the formal process of getting the rights for public easement along the trail. And so, it's not an approved project until we've gone through all of these processes successfully. And as we're doing that right-of-way process, working with the property owners to get all the approvals and the rights to do that public access, we'll also be doing the final design. And only after all of those steps are done does the project get approved by council, and we can award a contract for construction. And so, Matt, if there's anything that I missed in that, let me know.
Can I just comment on that? It feels like a lot of money to spend. Maybe this is the order you have to do things in. It feels like a lot of money to spend on a project that you don't have the ability to do. So as like a taxpayer and a small business owner in Sacramento, it doesn't feel like the best way to spend all of our money to jump through all these hoops, and then at the very last step go, oh, do I actually have the rights to do it?
Sure, and I agree, especially for projects that have federal funding, there are a lot of steps that we're just required to do. I think that the intention of having this prescribed path that we have to take is to protect the taxpayer money, because what we don't want to do is go through the process getting all of our right-of-way in place, coordinating the big changes with the property owners, and then find out that there's some sort of environmental impact that makes the project not feasible, because then we've done it for nothing. And so the first step is to make sure that the project is feasible and that there aren't unknown impacts that we won't be able to mitigate for or address. And then only once we know that it can be a real project is when we go through the steps of actually working with the property owners to get the rights for it. So you're right, it's a long, tedious process. And we're just starting off on it.
I would just add, Megan, in addition to, making sure that public dollars are spent properly, there's also an element of public trust here. I mean, part of the environmental clearance process involves public outreach and getting feedback and comments on those documents before the project is approved, in this case at the city council level for CEQA. And it would be a little problematic to say, yeah, hey, we'd really like your feedback. We're really going to listen to it. And by the way, we're already assuming this project is moving forward, so we're buying the right of way. There's unusual circumstances where that right of way acquisition will get advanced, but they're pretty specialized. And I agree with you, Jason. There's a lot of hoops you jump through. I've had to learn to be a very patient man to work through the state and federal processes, but. Yeah, and it's not quick or particularly inexpensive. I do agree with you.
I do hear you. I just built a boat dock last year and went through a lot of all those same processes. So I understand that, which is another reason why this project sort of feels like it impacts a lot of us in not necessarily a great way. So two other questions. Well, one comment, and then if you guys can address the last question. Megan, your concern about people nefariously hiding behind a privacy wall sort of concerns us on a privacy. You can probably hear my 1.5-year-old in the background screaming. The levees, I don't know, 20 feet above my backyard and about 30 feet away from my pool. As soon as the fences went down and construction started, I had a ring cam that spotted like 2 people like coming down towards my back gate and then running away. As soon as the light turned on, that hadn't happened in the 5 years that I lived here before that happened. I think security is going to be a very big deal. These houses weren't designed to have a bike trail on the back of them. They're very close to the levee. I get that it's neat. It's a fun project. People are very passionate about it. They like to ride bikes. I like to ride bikes. But there are alternative ways to get around here. And so that was the other question. Is there any consideration of not building it on top of the levee and building it through an existing park that would be much cheaper and achieve the goal of actually connecting the pocket to downtown? Because this project doesn't do that, right? It connects us to Scott's or to Miller Park.
So first, circling back to the privacy wall idea, if I can scratch my previous answer, because since I haven't actually been out there, I don't know quite what I'm picturing in terms of how much space there is between the backyards and what the configuration is. And so I think it's way premature for me to even have an opinion on a privacy wall at the top of the levee until I get more information about that. We will want to make sure there are.
Can I invite you over to take a look at it and see what it would be like?
Oh, absolutely. And to this point, we have been trying to avoid going back there because we do know that some folks have concerns about anyone on their private property. And so I do think it'll be great for us to go back there, especially for people who want us to see the situation. I think that would be very helpful for us. And so, I don't want to make it sound like I'm ruling out ideas. That was just me putting on my engineer hat. And
no, it wasn't the idea that I thought was bad. It was that your reaction that you were worried about nefarious people on the levee. Right. 'Cause you know that that is probably going to happen. If you've ridden your bike on any other part of the bike trail, that's a percentage of the people that use the bike trail. And now we're opening that up to very close to our house on property that isn't allowed to have tall fences. You couldn't build a fence tall enough to actually block people from the top of the wall to be able to see in my backyard. But you have to, like, for safety of Sacramento, you need to be able to see the levee toe and see if there are issues with the levee.
Right, right.
You're concerned that people with bad will are going to be on the bike trail. That's all of our concern as well. So I don't know that there's a resolution to that.
Our first step will be to look into options. And so our minds are open about the options, and we'll do our best to do things that are productive and that won't inadvertently create other issues.
So back to my next follow-up question.
Next question. Yes, thank you.
Is one of those options using an existing bike trail that cuts through all of the pocket already and achieves the goal of connecting pocket to downtown, which this plan does not?
So what we've been tasked to do here is to develop the Parkway plan, or the Parkway project, as part of the larger plan for a public space waterfront trail that connects along the Sacramento River, ultimately up to the American River trails. And so that's kind of the ultimate vision, is to have this riverside facility. And there are, of course, other pieces that would need to happen to make that happen. So the pocket does have other really great bike facilities, along the canal and things like that. And so, our task right now as engineers, we are doing the technical evaluation. We're doing the analysis and the studies and the plans. When it comes to making policy decisions about whether this is the best solution, whether this is something that is the best for Sacramento, that is out of the engineers' hands. The policy decisions are ultimately made by council. Okay. And so, that's kind of the realm of what I can control, is just the technical.
That makes sense. Thank you.
Thank you for your questions, Jason.
Thanks, Jason. We're going to ask Don Murphy to unmute. Hi, Don, go ahead.
In your analysis and your review, I'm curious how many private property owners are in your crosshairs that you need the easement rights from?
Matt, I think you're the best person to talk numbers.
Yeah, Don, I don't have an exact number in front of me. Suffice to say, a fair number, and the majority of them, I'm looking at a map right now. I'm just not able to count, but most of there's a few south of Arabella, and most of the parcels where there is an easement, where the city will need an easement, are north of Arabella. There's various segments for various reasons along the stretch where an easement already exists.
Well, during these presentations, I don't want to say that it seems casual that these easement rights will be obtained at some point, because I think you're going to find there's quite a bit of resistance. So that's why I'm curious, how many people are you dealing with here that you need the easement rights from? I would think that's a significant piece of information for this project.
It is, and there's a fair number. I just don't want to quote the wrong number. I don't have it at my fingertips at the moment. Don, I agree that this will be a continuing point of discussion, and we'll be prepared to go in more detail on exactly what the right-of-way needs are at future public meetings.
Well, I find it interesting that this is a significant hurdle to this project, And it seems to be treated kind of after the fact, casual. I'll use that word again. In addition to that, the $684,000 contract with Wood Rogers, this is only for the first couple of phases here with the environmental impact reports and I'm sorry, I forgot what the EIR and the preliminary engineering. Is that what constitutes the contract for $684,000?
I believe you're characterizing that correctly. Our current contract does not include an authorized final design or right-of-way acquisition phase.
Yeah, okay. So we, the citizens, the taxpayers in this community are funding that project up to that point without the assurance that you're going to have the recreational easement rights on the properties.
So Don, thank you for your question. The way that federal funding works is that we can only go to a certain point in the project before we get our environmental clearance. And so we are required to do the preliminary engineering and get the environmental clearance first before we're allowed to move on to those next phases. Yep. And so we don't want to encumber money that we aren't authorized to expend yet. So once we check those boxes, then we do a supplemental agreement that will cover the final design and the right-of-way phase.
Okay, I understand that. Thank you.
Thanks, Don. We're going to go to Patty Castillo next.
Hello. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Okay. I just had a few questions from if there's been any statistics run or surveys done for the homeowners that live currently on the side of Sacramento River that it's already open as a parkway. If they've had any crimes, if there's like statistics showing anything that's been going on in their areas. And then I just wanted to make sure that I'm understanding correctly that if this project gets completed, the parkway or the bike trail would be on the top of the levee, and that each side of the levee would still be under our ownership or under private ownership. So if somebody steps off of the levee, either direction, either towards the river or towards our home, that they would still be they would be leaving the public parkway and going on to private property. Is that correct?
Patty, that's a great question. I don't know that I know the answer to that yet. Matt, do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, what's being contemplated and what I would expect in terms of right-of-way needs at the top of the levee would be a public easement. And so for the parcels where there is already rights for a trail there, it's in the form of an easement. And so you're right, if folks were to move down the levee on either side, they would be getting out of that easement.
Okay, so my concern is how that would impact our insurance also, our homeowners insurance. If somebody steps off of that onto the private property and then hurts themselves or, hurts someone else, that kind of thing. So I'm just curious if that's, been taken into consideration. The other thing is, I don't know if how new you are to the project or how much research has been done, but just the public misconception of the homeowners in general. I feel like there's articles that are written all the time that go out to the public about us being greedy and unreasonable. And so as soon as construction started working, the amount of people that race and see the opportunity to come back there and argue with us and tell us that they have the right of way, it's the city's property, it's not our property, we can't ask them to leave. We've learned to just, either try to not argue with them. It's a really interesting situation. And I feel like the public, they have such a negative idea of who we are and what they don't understand. They don't agree that it's private property. They don't agree that they can't be back there even now. And so I'm just curious if that's also being taken into consideration of the information that's being put out to the public. Just kind of writing all of, I don't know if I'm saying that correctly, but providing the correct information.
Conforming limit is actually private property.
Right. It's been interesting. People that don't know us, but definitely have words for us and names to call us. So I'm just curious if that's been taken into consideration too.
Hey, Megan, I'll take this one.
Okay, go ahead.
Patty, in terms of the communications and outreach, including what's posted on the project website and information that we're able to post out regarding this project, we've made it very clear in the notifications and the fact sheets that are being developed that the property along the levee is still private property, and that regardless of whether or not the fences were taken down for the levee improvement project, that in fact it is private property, and until the city has moved forward with a project and does obtain easements, that it is continued to be private property. And it's something that this project team knows is a particular issue, and is something that we're keen on to make sure that that's communicated to the public.
Okay, thank you.
And Patty, if I can also just kind of jump in, I just want to say that, I'm sorry that you've been facing this. You guys shouldn't be made out to be villains. Your concerns are reasonable. You're homeowners, and this is important to you. And so, I would hope that people would understand the position that you're facing and the concerns that you have. And we certainly do. And so we'll go through the process. Our role is technical in nature, but sorry, I'm reading the chat.
I was trying not to name names, but
we are all humans on the project team. We're all homeowners, and so we are empathetic, and we will do our best to work through the process with you and to hear you on this. With regards, I think you brought up liability, if I'm circling back. So that is something that came up in our meeting last night. And so I followed up with our real estate folks to ask about how that's handled in getting these easements. And so I was told that as part of the agreements, there will be some indemnification language in there so that the city would have the liability for injuries that occur on the trail. And so that's the information that I received today, just following up on some concerns that were voiced yesterday.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Patty. We're going to go back. It looks like, Mark, you have a follow-up question, so I'm going to ask you to unmute.
Well, yeah, I mean, I don't feel bad now because Jason asked a bunch, so I can start asking even more. Yeah, I mean, so there's a couple, but just on that about the liability, just because, I mean, even in the slides, Megan, that you put out earlier, and I know that it wasn't necessarily to the parkway itself, but you're kind of talking about access to coastal, lands and access to the river, especially. Excuse me. And so I think we all are aware that with folks are up there, especially if you look in other areas, right? I mean, you're always going to see people kind of going down and fishing, or if there's a flat area, especially behind my house on my property, the berm is pretty wide, and I've seen people down there before, setting up picnics, getting a little high, and so that's kind of a question, and that idea of not only of liability, but SAC PD, we've spoken with them before about trespassing. People are up there on the top, it's still private. There's no easement yet, so you can call that trespassing, but also they'll go down onto the property where my kid has a swing out there, or they're swinging and fall off the swing, break an arm. I mean, I know what they said is liability on the levee crown, but that's a big concern also. And I think folks that have boats or boat docks are worried about, that might fall back on them. The other question I had kind of attached to that is, I mean, has that conversation happened of, you know, I'm not advocating for it, but has that been an idea of, as opposed to just doing the kind of right of way for the parkway on the levee crown, where feasible, like the whole back lot, just so some people are like, I don't want to deal with it because I'm gonna have to deal with calling the police. SacPD has told us that, you know, on the list of like what's important, trespassing is down here, so we're not going to get, you know, I mean, you'll be lucky if you'll get someone to come out, and so has that question been, or, you know, has that idea been brought up about expanding the right of way onto the berm?
I think the idea has certainly been brought up today. So, you know, this is something that we'll discuss as a project team. This has been very helpful, bringing up things that we need to discuss. So, yeah, we'll look into that.
Okay.
If I can add on to that, Mark, ideas like this are really awesome for the team. I mean, my attitude up till right now has been, we need to do everything we can to minimize any right-of-way requirements that need to be acquired. It's an interesting idea to say, hey, just from a liability standpoint, maybe it makes sense for at least some locations to acquire rights beyond just the crown of the levee, and I think that's definitely worthy of more discussion. And related to that, you know, how the indemnification language, what that might look like. You know, as Megan said, we can't get anywhere near the area of negotiating anything in terms of right of way until the environmental documentation is complete. That's part of the rules with federal dollars. But we can certainly start talking about preferences and what options might be. We just need to tread sort of carefully in that regard until the NEPA is complete. But I think it is a timely discussion.
I have another question, actually. Matt, you had mentioned earlier, you had mentioned Department of Transportation funding, and so I know that is a question that folks have been having, the distinction between the types of funding and what that means. So is there different pools of money, and that will basically like change how the parkway will be? And I mean, what does that mean in terms of, like, if we're getting it from the state or the Department of Transportation, is it now not a parkway? Is it not a park? Is it now
so
active?
The funding, that's a really good question. The funding that we get won't change how the project looks or is designed. It will just affect the steps that we have to take in order to get that money. So there's different pots of money, and different pots of money will pay for different, you know, they prioritize different types of projects. And so part of our job is to look for the funds that align with what the project is going to be and work to line those up. And then, you know, if it's federal funding, then there's just certain federal processes that we have to take in order to get that money. If it's state funding, there are some different steps that we have to take. It's administrative and bureaucratic, but we'll line up funds that match our project rather than changing our project around to match our funds, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. I think because someone had mentioned the American River earlier, and I was talking with the ranger up there, and he was saying that there's a curfew, but you can't really enforce it because it's kind of an active corridor, and so people can move from at all hours up there. And he made it sound like it was dependent on the type of money that the project would receive. So that would be the worry, is that if this idea of curfew, which would be great, you know, it's set to dawn to be closed off, but if certain dollars prohibit that.
Yeah, change how it operates. So that's a good question. The idea of the curfew came up yesterday during the meeting. And it was an interesting idea. My understanding, and it's something I have to do more research into, my understanding is that facilities that are operated by parks, you know, if it's a park, parks can have curfews. Typically, like was mentioned, our transportation corridors that are public works facilities typically don't have like gates that close and things like that. But, you know, I think that it is worth having some high level discussions with both the transportation leadership and the parks groups to see if there are solutions that can be implemented to address some of these concerns.
Yeah, I mean, because the original park plans also obviously called for a curfew.
Yeah.
So if we're going off that to talk about the historical precedent of, you know, why it's been talked about for so long, it'd be great to keep that. Because that's a fear, right? I mean, the idea of like, oh, all the eyes on the levee can stop crime. And I guess that's true if it's in the middle of the day, but you're not going to have thousands of eyes on the levee at, you know, 2 a.m. when someone's trying to go into Jason's backyard or my backyard or anything like that.
And Megan, if I can just clarify a couple points. Mark, your question is great, and it's complicated. We do need to be cognizant. Sometimes different types of fundings do have strings attached to them in terms of how they're applied. At the moment, none of the funding that the city has identified would change the nature of the project as discussed so far, but that needs to be considered every time the city accepts funding. They need to look carefully at what the requirements are. And then just to clarify on the Caltrans front, for most federal dollars, not all, but most federal dollars associated with transportation related projects, Caltrans gets involved in the oversight of the funding, and by delegation from the Federal Highways Administration, they become the lead agency under the NEPA, the Federal Environmental Policy Act. So that's why Caltrans is involved. They're not actually involved in design oversight in any way, shape, or form, or really defining what the project is going to look like beyond coordinating with us on the environmental process and helping us define the environmental constraints out there.
That's good context. Thanks, Matt.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. Colleen, we're going to ask you to unmute, and then Delinda had a question in the chat that I'll read out once Colleen's finished with her questions.
All right, thank you. I do also have the same security and privacy concerns that have been raised already. We are very close to the levee, just like other people, and you can see right into most of my house right from the levee. But my question has to do with whether there's been any discussion of noise and mitigating the noise to come from having people now use that continuously in a as a bike path or walking path, or in any manner beyond just having people walking by talking all the time. Because I'm so close, I would hear that echoing. We have animals that are going to react to people up there. It will be constant noise. My dog already alerts me anytime anyone's on the levee, and if somebody's using it continuously, I and all my neighbors are going to hear from my dog all day. So is there any plans to mitigate the impact on noise from the new bike path?
So Colleen, as a owner of a very vocal Australian Shepherd, I completely get your point on that. As part of our technical studies, as part of our technical studies for our environmental clearance, we are going to be doing a noise study and evaluation. Whether it gets down to the level of, looking at the volume of, talking and kind of casual noise, I'm not sure about that. But we are going to be looking at noise as a technical study. Matt, do you have any follow-ups on that?
I guess just sympathy for Colleen. There's not a great technical silver bullet for something like that. If it was a freeway, you were building a new freeway, put in a giant masonry sound wall, that's not appropriate here. There's opportunities to mitigate some of that sound depending on what might be planted out there. But then again, there's limits on what you can plant on the levee. So it's a fair point. It's a great question, and there's not a simple solution to that. So Colleen, I hear you. And I think that's a great topic for more discussion, but I don't have a quick fix for you on that.
Great, thanks, Colleen. Dawn, you're up next. I'm going to ask you to unmute.
ADA compliance. I noticed, Mr. Salveson, you mentioned that issue, and although the slide came and went on the access points that you're considering, there were 10 on that slide, and you said it might go down to 5. It appears that those access points are typically going to be located, especially in my area down here, would be on the cul-de-sacs. Is that your anticipation?
Some of them are being considered on cul-de-sacs, but I wouldn't call that typical. Some of the factors, if you look at all the circles on the southern end, for example, we certainly aren't going to put access points right next to each other. They'll be spread out. So it's a matter of spacing for a number of reasons, and looking at where the existing bicycle patterns are on the surface streets, as well as any constraints at individual locations, ranging from environmental constraints to safety concerns and so forth. So some are certainly being considered at cul-de-sacs, but I wouldn't say that's typical.
Okay, and restrooms in regards to ADA compliance or whatnot, is that an issue?
I don't believe we're contemplating new restrooms at any of these locations. In future meetings, we'll be providing some sort of typical renderings of what these might look like. There'll be ramps going up the side of the levee. We want to try and make them context sensitive and appropriate. But in general, there'll be ADA compliant ramps with some thought given to lighting where that's appropriate. But Megan, correct me if I'm wrong. I don't think we're putting bathrooms out there.
No, that's not part of the project.
I'm not an ADA person in terms of understanding the requirements, but I'm thinking about the steep slope on that levee, at least as it existed before they shaved it down. And if I understand it correctly, an ADA person in a wheelchair would have to be able to wheel his or herself up and down any kind of ramp, which to me would require a really lengthy set of switchbacks in order to get up that levee. Am I right or wrong about that?
I think you're on the right track. You can't go straight up. There would have to be either a long gradual ramp or more likely some sort of switchback pattern. And it would vary a little bit by location.
So it could actually go across multiple properties, homeowners' properties in doing so.
We want to avoid that, but in theory, yes.
And Don, that's one of the things that we will be accounting for as we're looking at, I think Matt mentioned there were about 10 locations that we're evaluating now. And so as we're doing that evaluation, we'll be looking at what it would take to make an ADA compliant path work at that location. We're trying to avoid impacts to private properties as we do so, or impacts to trees and things like that. And so we'll be taking into account what it takes to make that happen as we're narrowing down those access point locations.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Don. We have one question that I did miss from Delinda. Delinda's question was, is the intention then to acquire our waterside back lot? And is it not being spoken? And I think the intent there, the question, just to clarify, is the intention when we talk about right-of-way acquisition to acquire the waterside ownership as well. And Matt, I think you probably did touch on that with Mark's question a bit earlier.
Yeah, the intent is no, although the suggestion from Mark that some sort of rights transfer on the water side might actually be appreciated at some locations is interesting and something I certainly hadn't thought of before. But the intent was just the levee crown and to provide to obtain an easement on that.
Great. And then there's one question from Gerald Miles in the chat, and then we're going to go to Mark. Thanks for taking the time to hear out our questions and concerns. Can you please set our expectations for how you'll answer the questions you were not able to answer on this call? Example, number of properties and design related questions to have the trail on a berm, etc.
Yeah, and no, we'll have to between our team and the city talk about the agenda for the next public meeting. So I that may or may not be addressed in the next public meeting, but I think in the near term those items should all be discussed. And I think various elements of right of way is probably an appropriate item on the next round of public meetings in the near term. Those are not on the calendar at the moment. But we're talking, we're not talking months before those additional talks occur.
Great.
And
Thanks,
I
Matt.
think, I think when it comes down to elements that are kind of easy to check quickly, like the number of properties for right-of-way acquisition, that's the sort of thing we should be able to pull that in pretty short order. And so, Noah, what do you think would be the best way to handle that? We could have interested parties provide email addresses and we could follow up on that, or we could post it somehow. And when it comes down to the design related questions about the berm, that's something that's going to take a bit longer for us to sort through and evaluate. But you know, some of these that can be answered quickly. Like to try to find a way to be responsive.
What we have been able to do in the past is develop an FAQ and then post that on our project website. And so these are great questions. Sorry, Matt.
I think that's good with respect to the right of way. I mean, as Don pointed out, there is a bit of there's a few items to sort out in terms of the right of way implications at the access ramps, but we can certainly, just for the trail itself on the top of the levee, we can come up with a number for that. I just want to be very careful about putting hard numbers out there where we're not 100% certain. So we'll just need to make sure that it's crystal clear exactly what those numbers represent, but we can definitely share that information.
Mm-hmm.
Great. And I think I might have misspoke. I don't think Mark asked that last question. I think it was Gerald. But Mark, I think you or your partner have a question, so I'm going to ask you to unmute. There you go.
Hi. Yeah, so I'm Katie. I'm Mark's wife. Forgive me, I'm still recovering from like an entire July of COVID, so I almost don't have a voice. So I have lots of questions, and forgive me if I come across as a little salty. We just honestly don't feel like we've been really heard. And we feel, as other people mentioned, that we're being painted as, you know, really unreasonable, you know, like rich homeowners. And that is not the case. We don't know who to talk to. We don't know who the decision makers are. There's like 15 agencies involved, and nobody has been able to guarantee us a promise of safety, security, and privacy. So one of my questions was, who is the final decision maker for this work? Is it your organization? Is it a government agency? Who is it? And how do we communicate with them on a regular basis?
So our role as public works staff, as technical staff, our role is to evaluate the technical aspects of this project. And so that is to do the analyses, the environmental clearance, the design, to reach out to you folks to get feedback to help inform that design and evaluation. And then ultimately, you know, we complete the technical aspect of it, but we aren't policy folks. And so when it comes to policy decisions about approvals of projects, City Council is who ultimately approves whether the project is moves forward or not.
And just to piggyback off of Megan, Katie, I know that Mark has reached out quite a few times now to the project email. It's something that we recently launched. And one of the things that the project team here, Matt, myself, and Megan commit to is if you do have questions, reach out to us. If we don't know the answer to it, or if it's a different agency, we're all pretty resourceful. We've all worked with local agencies and state and federal agencies for a long time, and we'll do our best to help point you in the right direction if it's not something that's directly impacted by the city of Sacramento. If it's something related to the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and their work, we can put you in contact with those folks as well. But use us as a resource.
I just wanted to mention that we have contacted a lot of those agencies, and most people hand wave us off to the other agencies. So there's real pain for us right now. But thank you for that. We'll keep doing that. I know my husband's like ultra involved. He knows all the stats. He knows all the emails. So I believe this question was asked while I was in the other room watching the girls. I still don't understand though why the green belt isn't sufficient for a recreational trail, and I don't understand why that isn't on the table for you to recommend to whoever the final decision makers are. I get that you're tasked with having it go around our homes, but the reality is that our houses were not built for public access. And so like we own to the river with the easement in between for the levee itself. And Matt, I was hearing you talk about, oh, maybe we should ask to take more land on the other side of the levee. Like, that's not what I would like to have happen. I love that property on the other side of the river. Mm-hmm. And so I still would strongly recommend that you consider as an option pushing for just that one chunk, the green belt, which is a perfectly usable recreational trail that barely has any stops or starts in it. Along with that, I wanted to ask, so is there a precedent for the government taking property for something recreational? Because that seems pretty sad, especially since the green belt is already there.
Well, there is a process for working through that right-of-way acquisition process. And, ultimately, the city would make the case for why it's warranted. And, we aren't ultimately the ones who make the decision on that. And so
you probably could submit a plan that pushes traffic through the green belt.
So the nuance there is that the purpose of the project is to create a riverside trail. And so ultimately that's kind of what we have to deliver as far as a technical design. But as part of our scope is to identify the challenges with doing so and identify the trade-offs and what the issues are. And so, ultimately we'll be working through these, and it will be incumbent on the policymakers to decide whether it is in the best interest or whether it is not.
Okay. Yep. Thank you.
Thank you.
And when you said the city makes the case, who on the city makes the case?
Megan, do you want me to run through some of the right-of-way stuff?
Please, Matt. Thank you.
Yeah. So again, the right-of-way acquisition phase cannot start until the environmental documentation is completed and approved for the work. So this is some ways out. But because, as you might imagine, because of the public dollars involved, both at the local level, state level, federal level, there's a whole bunch of rules and hoops, and those are there for good reasons. In very general terms, the properties or any of the rights that get transferred, in this case, we're talking, for example, about a transfer of rights for a public easement over to the city. There's a formal process for how a value is established for that in the appraisals and the property owners have a role to play in that as well. So
can you give us a little more detail on that? Who, like, what agency?
It would be the city and or a consulting team such as ours, and it's done by real estate brokers coordinate that. And there's licensed appraisers that specialize in this, but they're the same type of appraisers that would be hired when you purchase a house.
Can we hire our own appraisers?
Pardon?
Can we hire our own appraisers?
Yeah, so what happens on the city side is they'll hire an appraiser and they'll hire a review appraiser. And then you'd be given an opportunity. And when the time comes, you're going to get all sorts of details on that. And then you can hire a review appraiser that is even subsidized by the project. So you can hire your own appraiser to check against the work that the city's been done. And then once, assuming that there's a meeting of the minds on what the price is, the appropriate value is, then you can get into the weeds on what is actually in the agreement. The indemnification clauses we were talking about would be an important point. And so every effort would be made to come to an agreement without going to condemnation and eminent domain, which I think is what you referred to or asked about in terms of a precedent. Once you get into that mode, Megan, if the city still wants to proceed with the project, and that's a policy decision by the city and the city council in particular, and they do go to eminent domain, there's a whole process for that, and that goes to court, and the decision is ultimately made by a judge, not by city staff or your elected officials.
And I was just wondering, when you say the city, I'm just trying to figure out if there's like an agency, like the parks agency, or is it?
In this case, for this project, the Public Works Department, the group Megan works for, would be the lead in coordinating that right-of-way acquisition. The city has staff, and that's what they do. They specialize in right-of-way, and to some extent, they'll likely be supported by the consultant team. It has not been defined or determined whether the lead right-of-way agents and brokers would be city staff or consultant hired by the city.
Okay, thank you. That's helpful information.
Yeah, and there's a lot of detailed information that goes into that everybody will get later, but none of it's a secret. And if you or any of the other residents want to know more about the process, we can certainly get something in the FAQ.
Yeah, and I think again, that's where we don't have like a ton of trust, or like we don't know who to ask. So I mean, this is helpful now that we know that we can reach out to you.
You can ask. We'll get to the answers. It's a lot of hoops to jump through. It's confusing as all heck for everybody, and it's a fairly complex process. Yeah. Because there's public dollars involved, and there's a genuine effort to come up with a fair and equitable agreement and still be a good custodian of public dollars. So,
yeah. And then I just had one final point. Well, first of all, I really hope the environmental review caught that we have bald eagles living up here, because that's fantastic and gorgeous and amazing. And then I did want to ask, like, we have a gorgeous redwood in our backyard that's huge. It provides most of our shade. We have a beautiful oak in our backyard. I'm scared that you're going to cut them down, and that would be devastating. And again, no one can really answer me on that question. So
without having seen your yard or your tree locations, I could say that at the city of Sacramento, we go to every effort that we can to avoid cutting down trees. There's a long process to do so because we value trees and don't want to lose them. And so that is, I would think that the only time that a tree would come into play is if it happens to be where we're looking at the access ramp locations, because the trail itself is going to be at the top of the levee, as is the plan right now. And so, there wouldn't be any impacts to trees arising from that component itself. Where we're doing the access ramps, in order to provide the flat enough grade for all users to be able to navigate up, sometimes those ramps can be a little bit lengthy, but that's where we're going through the evaluation of all of those different locations. And we're specifically looking at avoiding tree impacts where possible in the selection of those locations.
Okay. And, again, I'm not trying to dumb this down as being about money, because it's also about, again, safety, security, privacy. We have 2 little kids. We absolutely love our house. We knew that a bike trail probably would be going in, but there have been so many surprises. Like, if it's a transit corridor, that is totally different than a bike trail. And so that makes me very, very nervous. But I just want to, again, say that, like, I don't have a ton of trust that you'll be like, okay, we'll pay you this much. And then they'll be like, oops, we need to cut down your redwood. And so I just really strongly need all of those impacts to be part of the conversation.
It will, and in future public meetings, we will be looking, we'll be presenting some of our ideas, thoughts, concerns, questions on those access points, and you and the other residents will have an opportunity to weigh in. I have real trouble imagining a scenario where we'd be taking down anybody's large trees in their backyard.
I mean, just so you know, our neighbor down the way, they just had a huge, gorgeous tree cut down that provided most of their shade in their backyard, but it was for the levee repairs. And that was pretty devastating.
And that's a good point. I don't like to throw other agencies under the bus, but that wasn't us. And there are some other, I can't speak to who that was, but if you look at what we're proposing to do here, impacts to trees really need to be minimized in general. And we're trying to put the access points as far as we can from people's immediate living areas. And you'll see that more and have a chance to weigh in on all that.
Okay, thank you.
We have 2 questions in the chat that I'm going to read out to Matt and Megan. And then we'll go to Dawn. The first question is from, there's no name, it's just numbers, it's 6320. It says, hello, thanks for the opportunity to communicate. Our daughter walks to school. If there's an access point on the street like ours, how are you looking at the impacts and safety of increased traffic? Would we be allowed to have standard solid fencing versus having see-through fencing now at the toe of the levee? And lastly, who negotiates the cost and payment of the right-of-way? Is that your group, and how is the value determined?
Let me take the last answer first. I think I addressed the last question regarding negotiation of cost and payment. There's a formal appraisal process that informs those discussions, and ultimately it's either city staff or consultants working directly for city staff that conducts those negotiations, and those folks are either licensed real estate agents or real estate brokers. In terms of what the fencing might look like, whether it's at the toe of the levee or anywhere else, I think that is still very much an open question. And in terms of how are we looking at impacts to safety and increased traffic, that's an explicit, and I think I had a bullet on that on one of the first slides. That's an explicit consideration in the access points. We want to look for an appropriate balance between maximizing access to the trail from bicycles on the surface streets, for example, while avoiding creating parking or traffic issues in front of existing residences. And that is a little bit challenging, and that's something we're going to be looking for specific input from the public on.
And while we're going to be evaluating these things as we're making the access point location selection, we're not going to be constructing parking lots with this project, but there are existing decent sized parking lots at the parks at either end, which it seems like if there are folks who are actively trying to drive to get to the trail, those larger parking lots will probably be more attractive for them. My anticipation of how like the intermediate access points will be is I want them to be good for the neighborhood to come up and use it, or connections to other trails. We're not looking to have significant vehicle volume going to those intermediate smaller access point locations.
Great, thanks Megan and Matt. One other question in the chat. This is from, again, no name, it's an iPhone 169. It says, is the plan to take all of the Riverside properties in the Little Pocket as well as the Pocket in Greenhaven to make the Riverside Trail contiguous from Garcia Bend to downtown without any segments off the levee?
So an expansion of the trail through Little Pocket is included in the ultimate vision for the development of the trail from Freeport Boulevard to the American River Trails as established in the implementation plan for the Sacramento and American River Trails. However, when it comes to actual projects that move in toward the engineering, we're focusing on Pocket first. Decisions on when and if Little Pocket will become a project will be made by city leadership and planners in the future.
Great, thanks, Megan. We are going to shift to Dawn. Dawn, you had a follow-up question. I'm going to ask you to unmute.
Yeah. Since you're, by the way, thank you very much for spending all your time and discussing this with us. I think it's very, very helpful. Along with interviewing or discussing with we property owners, have you considered talking to the maintenance guys at DWR, MA9, who actually have to maintain the levee and their frustrations with the traffic on the levee at this point, which is minuscule in comparison to what it will become as a transportation route? Are you going to interview those folks? The worker bees at DWR?
So
Dawn, take that one, Megan.
Okay, I'll give a little intro to that, and then if I miss anything, as usual, you can jump in and add to it. So we have met with the folks with DWR and MA9 to have some initial discussions. It's very early in the process, but it was important to us to get some initial feedback from them and to make them aware of the project so they're not caught by surprise for it. Matt, do you want to jump in on that?
Yeah, Don, you're spot on. We've already had discussions. The formal 408 permit process does not kick in until we get into the final design phase, but we'll be having discussions with all the players that are part of that 408 discussion, and we're having those conversations now to make sure we understand what their concerns are. And implicitly, as I think you sort of implied, those maintenance folks know their stuff, and we pay a lot of attention to what they say.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and they don't like all that traffic, kids, baby buggies, you name it. They have to stop their mowers, they have to wait, and it gets in the way of them doing their job. And I just want to make one other point, since I'm hearing my difficulties with this. Those of us that live on a levee, strongly view this route, this transportation route, call it what you want. It's going to become a thoroughfare for homeless. And what do you see in every homeless camp where you see a picture? Bicycles. Bicycles everywhere in homeless camps. So please list that as one of my great fears. This is what's going to happen if you build that bike trail. Thank you.
Thank you, Don. Mark, you had a follow-up question? I'm going to ask you to unmute.
Yeah, and again, thanks for, just re-emphasizing what everyone has also said in the chats and taking the time to answer all of our questions. And yeah, this has been really informative, and you know, my wife and I really do appreciate it. I think she asked a question in here also in the chat, but I had a specific question about, you know, with the not saying that you guys don't, but like, you know, during the current kind of levee work, you know, we would go to the flood protection board or the city about specific things. And, you know, folks would be like, well, you got to reach out to the city because this is, we're not focusing on this. Or we reach out to the city and say, you know, the cross levee gates aren't, you know, DWR is in charge of that. So you got to reach out to them. So the other, like on that front, there's an erosion control project that's starting in Little Pocket that's heading down to you know, down to Garcia Bend, where they're going to be kind of putting riprap down, just massive construction work that the Corps, I believe, is doing. And that's slated to go all the way through 2025 or 26. So my question, I guess, is on the, you know, the EIR, how can the city kind of conduct an EIR project when there's massive erosion control happening and, you know, everything shifting or changing, as well as the actual environmental kind of footprint is going to be changing with what's happening down there? Do you guys do that concurrently, or is there like a way that you'd have to wait for it to be done? Also, where they're working up in Little Pocket, I mean, it's all, the whole top of levee shut down. So I'm assuming that if the trail is trying to be open by 2025, it's then going to be shut down for immediately because of the erosion control project.
I can speak to that first, Megan, and then please fill in any gaps there. Yeah, Mark, that's challenging. You know, we don't have a static target out there. So, for example, we flew the aerial topography to help us with the preliminary design. We know perfectly well we're going to have to hit that again, particularly at the access points post construction. So, we're planning to do that. In terms of the environmental studies and the project footprint, we're trying to be as broad as possible with what the study areas are, so that we can cover all of that. And then finally, we are coordinating with Army Corps of Engineers. As you might imagine, they have their own environmental documentation for the work that's being done out there. And we're trying to build off of that, leverage off of that, make sure we're consistent with it. In terms of timing of any future construction, we don't have a construction start date yet. And if needed, we can certainly coordinate the work with Army Corps of Engineers, but certainly it'd be preferable to be able to roll out there after their work is complete. So that'll be an ongoing point of discussion.
Gotcha.
You just defined a lot of my stress over the next few years, Mark. You're spot on.
And I actually want to empathize with the challenges of sorting through the maze of bureaucracy that comes with dealing with so many different agencies. We're going through the same thing as well. You know, we have to go through similar levels of coordination, and it is kind of robust and can be challenging. And you know, hopefully, you know, for us, if you ask us questions, and we get questions all the time about things that don't follow under our umbrella or our jurisdiction, and you know, we'll always try to be helpful and point you in the right direction. Hopefully, it doesn't come off as pointing fingers exactly, but you know, we just want to get you in touch with the people who have authority to speak to certain points.
No, not at all. And I've already kind of been emailing. I think maybe I was emailing your old email address, and then Noah was answering, and so I was talking with Noah. So I do appreciate the outreach. And so.
Great, thanks, Mark. It doesn't look like we have any. Actually, we have a question, Mark, that you had put in the chat. Megan, Matt, I'm gonna just kind of throw this one to you guys. It says, has taking the trail across the river on the Clarksburg West Sac side, where there's already a public road, been evaluated? I think riding across the river would be stunning and cool.
So I agree, that would be very stunning and cool. Decisions like that are kind of more in the planning purview. We have a team of transportation planners who look at different options for making connections and getting around to where people want to go. We basically take our lead from what the planners resolve on, and we look at the feasibility and the impacts of that. So that evaluating those things is a little bit outside the purview of what I'm allowed to do per se, but I do agree that that would be a very neat facility.
It doesn't look like we have any other questions in the chat or anyone else with their hands raised. If anybody does have a question, please feel free to raise your hand and ask. And if not, I think we'll be wrapping up the meeting if that's okay with everyone. What I do want to do is thank everyone for taking, a considerable amount of time out of their evening in the middle of the week to attend this. It's important for our project team to be able to hear from everyone and make sure that there is a meaningful conversation amongst property owners, because it does immediately affect you. What we will be doing is this, as we mentioned at the beginning of this meeting is being recorded, so we'll be able to post this online on the SacramentoRiverParkway.org website. And we will be able to provide that to everyone as access that has access to that. So if there are any of your neighbors that weren't able to attend this meeting, then they do want to watch this, they'll have the ability to do so. And we'll be posting our presentation to that website as well. So again, thank you everyone for taking the time this evening on behalf of Megan and Matt. We appreciate your time, and we will be following up in the future with a lot more public outreach and outreach meetings and communications regarding this project. Thanks everyone, and have a good night.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone.